So this is the last talk of this session. We have Layne Hall from Warwick, who will be talking about recognizing pseudo-Anosov flows with no homotopic orbits.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I think this conference is a really cool idea. I didn't have the endurance to not sleep last night, right? But I'll see it out to the end tonight. And it's nice to be finishing off for what I think looks like Team UK, if there's some sort of point system. So yeah, the title's there. This is a geometric group theory conference, and so I feel like the title maybe doesn't advertise that this is a geometric group theory talk, but it's sort of there in secret. Right? So the snapshot of what I want to talk about today is that I care about studying flows on three manifolds, but I'm particularly interested in having some sort of eye towards computation and algorithmic problems, right? So in the land of three manifolds and geometric group theory, sort of in their crossover, there's a lot of work done in this area, and I would like to leverage that as much as possible. But there's also a lot of recent work done on flows, on three manifolds in particular, that makes that possible. So I'm sort of like, the excited child in my class raising my hand, being like, let me use this for something, let me do anything with it. But because, pseudo-Anosov flows, I wouldn't say are like strictly geometric group theory. I think most of the talk will be sort of motivation. And so in the film, it's like 90% world building, 5% problem, 5% resolution in the structure. So we'll start with an example that demonstrates what we're looking for, right? So our example will start in a very familiar place. We'll have a nice closed surface sigma, which I've drawn over here. It's implicitly going to have some genus. And we're going to consider a homeomorphism of this surface that is pseudo-Anosov, right? So we just have F going on this surface. Now, any definition of pseudo-Anosov is sort of all right to keep in mind for your head for these examples, but it will be more sensible to pick one. So I will pick one. And I'll pick sort of the pair of foliations example. So I'm going to assume that F preserves a pair of invariant foliations of the underlying surface. They're transverse to each other, and there is potentially some singular points along the way. So here's my hand-drawn patch of F up here, but perhaps a bit more detailed is a nicer patch down the bottom. And F contracts one foliation and expands the other. So this little cartoon at the bottom should be showing that the purple is expanding because when I hit it with F, the green arcs get blown apart. So it must be the green, if my act drawing is accurate, that is getting contracted here. Okay, now the talk's about flows. So the flow is going to come from this pseudo-Anosov homeomorphism. And it's going to come on the form of the mapping torus, right? So we're going to do a sort of standard construction and build the three manifold obtained by taking the original surface, crossing it with just the interval, and going the top to the bottom by our homeomorphism F. And this is, it's a very famous studied form of three manifold, this surface bundle over the circle, right? But it also comes with a lovely flow as well, packaged in with the way that we built it, right? So on M, we have a flow where we can just sort of pick a point on our surface and walk directly upwards. And then when we get to the top, we follow back around, and either we go pretty much everywhere or eventually we close up, such as the dynamics of this flow. So it's sort of written down more formally there. Within the confines of this talk, and in most things that I care about concerning these flows, the speed at which we walk upwards really will not matter, right? So I've called the flow phi of t here, but it's really just like phi. It's just it's like a one-dimensional foliation oriented uniformly in some direction. And so we have, a lovely manifold, the mapping torus, and we also have a nice flow on the mapping torus as well. And the dynamics of this flow sort of mimics those of F. So if you know anything about the dynamics of a pseudo-Anosov, namely properties like it has a dense orbit, the periodic points are dense, these are all true for F. They're just scaled up one dimension. But outside of just studying the mapping torus, we do have various properties of the suspension flow that we care about when studying F and M. So some of those will be more or less important to us today. So I've called them classical facts. One classical fact is that the periodic orbits of phi, right? These are just loops in the three manifold. You follow the flow, you close up, periodic, but that's just a knot in M. So they're loops, but none of them are homotopic to each other. This is sort of an innocuous looking property, but if you think about it, it's actually quite deeply tied to the Nielsen-Thurston classification and the geometrization of these surface bundles. Or at least you should convince yourself it's true if you think hard enough about why these are true. Okay, so this one will come up later, but just the loops, they're not homotopic. Another property which maybe I put in here to be like, geometric group theory is not so far away here. So the suspension flow actually reflects really well the coarse geometry of the underlying manifold. So if you look on the universal cover of our three-manifold, the flow lines are uniformly quasi-geodesic. And actually, we end up with this really beautiful picture that Thurston and Cannon built, I think at some point in the 90s, where we have the universal cover of M, which is H3, the flow lines of phi, which wobble in some sort of coarse quasi-geodesic direction, and then maybe the more magnificent fact as well, which is that if you lift the fiber, there's a nice continuous map which extends it into the boundary of H3, but it does so as a sphere-filling curve. So it's sort of this beautiful three-way picture. We've got like the flow one-dimensional, and then the fibers eating up the entire boundary as well. Okay, and then the third classical fact that I want to care about this flow is talking about when they're the same, right? So if we have two different flows, let's say it's phi on some three-manifold n, psi on another one n, we're just going to call them equivalent if there's just a homeomorphism between the underlying manifolds, which takes orbits to orbits. So I forgot the notion of speed of the flow. I'm extra forgetting it now. It's totally gone. I'm just sort of globally sending what an orbit is across. And the important fact here, or neat observation here, that is just a nice little exercise, which is that if you have elements in the same mapping class group that are conjugates, their suspension flows are equivalent. And so this is maybe thinking back to what was the snapshot about? Well, it was studying flows algorithmically. Well, here is a lovely object, the mapping class group, which we're perhaps very familiar with studying in some algorithmic way, right? So it brings us to what is a natural question here? Well, when are two suspension flows the same? Is that sort of natural question? And the conjugacy problem in the mapping class group can at least be used to sometimes verify if suspension flows are equivalent. It's not always, having the solution isn't good enough to sort of completely solve my blue problem up here, but it's good to verify. And this problem is extremely well studied. So I've just listed a few citations here, Minsky, Bell, Webb, and lots of others, which, I didn't want to give a dictionary. And it can be done in practice. So Mark Bell has a program called Flipper, which if you haven't played with before, I don't know, it's an awesome Monday evening, right? So you just open up Flipper, start feeding in some mapping class groups and ask you to tell me if they're conjugate, ask you to tell me if they're pseudo-Anosov. Flipper can do all these things. But this question up here, this sort of motivating question, when are two suspension flows the same, is better answered by maybe a more modern or elegant solution that captures flows in different ways. So what we need to address here is that a suspension flow or a fiber three-manifold can fiber in many different ways. So it can fiber with different genus surfaces. So being able to solve the conjugacy problem for one mapping class group at a time is like not going to sort of totally distinguish when two suspension flows are the same, because the monodromies can come from two different groups. So instead, in 2010, Ian Agel has cooked up an invariant which solves this, and it's called a veering triangulation. So right now, we just sort of want to think of this as like a black boxed invariant, but there is a nice invariant of a suspension flow, which totally characterizes that suspension flow. And once again, this is implemented in Flipper. So you can go to Mark Bell's program, you can take two different conjugacy classes of pseudo-Anosovs from different fibers and be like, does this happen to be the same suspension flow? And it will be able to tell you. So we'll see more on this veering triangulation a little bit later, but this is like the end of the first example, right? So we've seen a flow or a nice class of flows, suspension flows. And here is a decision problem type question, and it is solved and it's even implemented. So that's some serious motivation. So let's take on maybe something more difficult. It's more difficult. There's a lot of work that went into those, but generalization of suspension flows. And these are going to be pseudo-Anosov flows. And I've sort of said here that this is an informal definition. The reason for that is because the definition is too long, but I do think the informal definition gives you pretty much all the intuition you need. It's highly compactified, so let's go through it. It's essentially saying that you look locally like a suspension, right? That's what to keep in mind. So why is it saying that? Well, we're going to start with a closed three-manifold. And what we're going to do is we're going to assume there's a pair of invariant codimension one transverse singular foliations. So on my right-hand side here, what I've done is I've taken the picture just from the suspension case, and I've suspended it up once. And I've only suspended the green foliation to sort of keep the picture coherent. But I have this two-dimensional foliation instead once I do the suspension action. So I'm assuming my flow has a pair of these, that it preserves them, that they're transverse, and that it expands one and contracts the other, right? This is not, it's not groundbreaking after what we saw for the suspensions. And a little more technical, we still have some sort of singular orbits, and the foliations are regular off of these, just like in the surface case. And then to fully take it home, for these singular orbits, we're just going to assume that they have small neighborhoods where the flow and foliations are conjugate to that of a suspension flow. Okay, so also maybe not mentioned here, these are periodic orbits, right? So these are closed loops, these singular orbits. And I'll throw in another assumption to make life extremely easy and keep things like the suspension flow. I'm going to assume the flow has a dense orbit. So this is a lot of packing to say everywhere I go in my three-manifold, if I just take a point and I follow the flow for a little bit, I might be confused for thinking I'm in a mapping torus of a pseudo-Anosov. And so these are the broad classes of flows that we want to consider. But it's maybe not so clear if I want to do some sort of decision problem like action on pseudo-Anosovs. Well, what is the finite description of them, right? That's definitely not carried in this definition. It's just some maybe more continuous structures, but there is one. And we can sort of contrast it to the suspension case. So how is a flow given? Well, let's like start with the suspension case, right? That is easier. You just give me the surface, and if depending on how you like to describe the mapping class group, maybe you give me some composition of Dane twists on the surface, right? So I've depicted this over here. This would be enough to totally encapsulate suspension flow. I've got to tell you it's genus one. Here are two curves to do some Dane twists on. And it's a mapping class, so it also defines a suspension flow. And then we come to something maybe a bit more terrifying. And also, like we're keeping with the informal thing here, but an arbitrary pseudo-Anosov flow can be described by a finite CW complex. So there is a finitary description made of what we call flow boxes. Right? And I say that these flow boxes satisfy some checkable conditions, again, to sort of avoid a nasty list. But I have an example here which allows me to sort of point out, well, what are the key properties here, right? So the first thing is that this is two boxes sort of stacked against each other. So one has a base with the letter A on it, the other has a base with the letter B on it, and then it's just sort of extended vertically. And on the top, it's all jumbled. So that's the one above A, that's the one above B. And the flow goes vertical inside these boxes, right? So this walking upwards from the A to the jumbled top here is following the flow. And then the sides of the boxes are meant to be parallel to those pair of foliations that we have, right? So I've got this purple arc, which is meant to be telling me, well, there's sort of this codimension one purple foliation going parallel to this side. And notice how these other purple arcs are all parallel. So all of those foliations are going parallel. All those leaves of the foliation are going parallel here. And then going in the opposite direction, I have the other foliation. So the boxes, or this description, is like a CW complex, but everything has a label. It's like you have a top that is like labeled going up, a bottom that is labeled like come through the bottom, and then you have sides that tell you what leaf you're supposed to belong to as well. And then the checkable conditions are essentially what the jumbling is, right? So you have to get some sort of interesting dynamics here. So having just the flow go from the top to the bottom again would be pretty dreadful. And so here, these like jumbled A's and the jumbled B's are actually exactly how the tops of these boxes are glued to the bottoms. So this top gets glued to some of A, like the bottom and the top, and also the top of B. And then the rest gets mapped over here. And the sides are glued to each other. So they're actually glued in this case just by like a Z2 translation across. So they're this little like box and box like tessellates the plane. Okay, so it's definitely a bit more complicated than the suspension case. And maybe the like something that's funny about it is this exact example here. It is this example. These are the same description of the same flow. So it suggests, in the suspension case, this is a little inefficient. But this is a way to present an arbitrary pseudo-Anosov flow, not just the fibered ones. And I've also got a little warning, right? This is a very non-unique way, just like this one is at the top, of describing the flow. But that's actually, if you want to do some sort of decision problem, that's a good thing. It's like, give me any sort of input data and let's get cracking with it. Okay, so we haven't seen any examples of non-suspension flows. So I think it's worth mentioning one and sort of spending like a minute or two fleshing it out. And this is the geodesic flow, right? So for the geodesic flow, you again start with a nice closed surface. This time you want it to be hyperbolic. And the flow is going to happen on the unit tangent bundle. And the orbits of this flow, if we haven't seen it before, what you can do is you just take your surface and you look at a closed geodesic on your surface. Choose a hyperbolic metric, whichever one you so please. So choose a geodesic on that surface. And this geodesic I've drawn here it's not simple, but when you lift it upstairs, because it intersects itself transversely, it becomes some nice embedded loop. And this is an orbit of the flow. And these are all orbits of the flow. So sort of if you want to know an orbit, draw a geodesic and lift it. And globally, you're sort of following geodesics downstairs. And so this is a non-suspension example, right? I mean, the underlying three-manifold is like some Seifert fibered space. Good luck trying to turn that into a, surface bundle over the circle. But the geometry also doesn't actually restrict us, right? So we have existence results that say that these pseudo-Anosov flows are very prevalent. So in this case, on hyperbolic three manifolds, Gabay, Moshe, and Landry and Tsang, sort of a folklore old result being modernized into a new result currently, tells us that if our manifold has positive second Betti number, so there's just some, non-trivial homological surface, then there is a pseudo-Anosov flow on M. So big manifolds have pseudo-Anosov flows, and they can have multiple. So for example, if you have something like the virtual fibering conjecture in mind, right, you might have a manifold that admits a pseudo-Anosov flow, then you lift it, the manifold becomes fibered, but you might just have two different pseudo-Anosov flows. So you can have lots of different pseudo-Anosov flows on the same manifold as well, precisely as how much is an interesting question in the field. Okay, and so then we come to like the main question, which is the old question we had, which is how can we tell pseudo-Anosov flows apart? Right, we asked this for suspensions. Let's ask this for pseudo-Anosov flows. And it turns out the key in a lot of these sorts of questions is to study the free homotopy classes of the periodic orbits. So what I mean by that is I've got my old suspension picture here, and I've got potentially this, pink or brown periodic orbit that just runs up once, comes back to itself, right? That's a periodic orbit of the flow. And maybe this blue one is one orbit as well. Maybe it's period 2 with respect to the fiber. And so these just define free homotopy classes in the underlying manifold, which you may prefer to think of as a conjugacy class in pi1m. So consider moving it around, wiggling it around. And this ends up playing like a very important role in how we study these flows. And a particular setting that we care about is when there are just none of these that are homotopic to each other. So my fun fact one about suspensions was that there are none homotopic to each other, right? So this is in the nice setting. And we have all sorts of nice results about this. So for example, Sergio Fenley showed that in this case, you sort of recover the suspension picture. So flow lines are uniformly quasi-geodesic on the universal cover. That was true of suspensions. And the fundamental group is hyperbolic without geometrization. So I actually think this is awesome, and I never get to sort of cite this anywhere. But having the flow is enough structure to tell you that your fundamental group is hyperbolic without having to invoke some extremely heavy hammers. Well, you build your own, or at least Sergio Fenley does. Okay, but this is the question we want to solve, right? And it's a question we haven't solved because it's maybe too difficult. But, well, for now, we'll see if somebody can. But in this setting, it's a bit more tractable. And the reason why, so let's say we're in this setting, phi with no homotopic orbits, and we'll add an additional assumption that there's at least one singular orbit. This seems pretty innocuous, but it's kind of not. And then a large group of people, so Igor Gerito, Schleimer Siegerman, and Landry Minsky-Taylor, over a body of work that sort of starts a decade ago and continues to the present, have fleshed out this big correspondence between pseudo-Anosov flows and this object I alluded to, veering triangulations. And so it's now time to sort of like pull the cloak off the hood. Like, what is a veering triangulation? Well, I'll describe it in like a cartoon, right? So on the left here, what we might have is our mapping torus flow. Like, this is my little cartoon of, okay, I've got a surface, maybe it's a torus, and I have a homeomorphism. That's my suspension flow. Then the correspondence tells us to drill whatever singular orbits you have. That might give you like a knot complement, like I've drawn here, the figure 8 knot complement. And then a part of this big correspondence is that this decomposes into a very nice, what we call veering triangulation of this drilled manifold. And sort of the combinatorics with some like the colors involved here in this triangulation actually give you a complete like total invariant of the flow. So like, what was the main motivating question? It was, when are two pseudo-Anosov flows the same, and how can we solve this in some finitary algorithmic way? Well, this correspondence says, get your hand on this thing. If you can get your hand on this invariant, the veering triangulation, you're essentially done. But a part of the problem was you might start with total junk. You might start with that silly box decomposition thing that I showed you, right? The input data might be very unclear as to what this triangulation is. And also, your flow might not even be in this setting, right? You might not be in this lovely no homotopic orbits setting. So this sort of begets, I think, a natural problem. And there are two sides of it, right? So suspension flows do not have homotopic orbits. They are in the good setting. Geodesic flows are in the bad setting. They do have homotopic orbits, and there are in fact a lot of examples on hyperbolic manifolds that do as well. So there is a serious decision to be made, and so it takes us to, the 5% of the story that is the problem, which is, given a pseudo-Anosov flow in this like finite complex description, tell me if it has homotopic orbits. In other words, tell me if it's in the good setting. If it is in the good setting, go ahead and find the magic invariant that solves all sort of recognition problems that I might want to solve. And so then 5% problem, 5% resolution. The theorem is that there is an algorithm to decide, given a box decomposition of a flow, if there are homotopic orbits. And even more so, we can get this invariant that we wanted along the way, this veering triangulation. And so in the final minute, right, it's worth mentioning, I think, the serious work that goes into solving this. Like I said, I'm sort of the kid in the class that wants to get involved, let me in, right? And some of the tools that let me in are some geometric group theory, yes, from Sela and Pro, which is a solution to the conjugacy problem of the underlying three-manifold. So this, knowing whether or not a pseudo-Anosov flow has homotopic orbits is like a global conjugacy problem for a subset of the fundamental group. It's like, I've got this infinite subset. Tell me if there is any conjugate elements in there. So this is sort of the local solution to the problem. And this can be used to verify a yes answer to having homotopic orbits. And it turns out finding bounds on such a thing is surprisingly stringent. So my solution is to split it and just hit it with a hammer from the other side, and also verify the no solution. So there's a result from Stephen Frankel, Henry Siegerman, and Sol Schleimer, which is that actually, if you can find the magic invariant in the first place that matches to your flow, then you are necessarily in the good setting. So it's like, I actually wanted this veering triangulation, right? I wanted this invariant all along. It turns out if you can just go and find it, the right one, then you'll be in the right setting and the invariant will be what you want. And so you break it into two, and then it's using sort of the data of the box decomposition to try and attack these two heavy hammers with. And that's the resolution, and so ends the story. Thank you.
Thank you, Layne. Let's thank our speaker.